So hello, let's talk about Ronald Reagan a little bit more, part two. Now with Reagan, we see the return of the Cold War, the return of the Cold Warrior. He is the one who gave the Soviet Union the infamous moniker, the Evil Empire. He believed Nixon and Ford were too soft on communism due to the advice of Kissinger. And his view was that if you exert economic and public pressure on the Soviets by initiating a major buildup of nuclear and conventional weapons, thereby hoping that the Soviets would do the same, this would bankrupt them. He was criticized for this spending, but replied, "It will break the Soviets first." And sure enough, it did. For example, the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, to construct anti-missile defense systems in outer space that would intercept and destroy Soviet missiles in flight. This was called Star Wars. The Soviets, in response, launched their own expansive research and development effort to keep pace. Now, again, Reagan was right about this. I mean, this would eventually lead to the fall of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. Now, we also have a new domino theory in place in South and Latin America. Reagan feared that communist victories in one American nation, South American nation, would lead to communist victories in others. So in El Salvador, we provided economic and military assistance to thwart communist revolutionaries. We helped to install Jose Napoleon Duarte as president to bring some stability to the small nation. In Nicaragua, we trained Contras, or counter-revolutionaries, to attack the Sandinistas and their bases in the country. And again, this would come up later in his presidency. In Grenada, a radical military council had seized power in 1983. There were appeals from nearby island nations asking Reagan for assistance, and this would lead him to eventually order 1,900 Marines to invade Grenada, depose the new government, and evacuate American medical students there. The UN would condemn this action, but it was popular among those who lived in Grenada and those in the surrounding areas, and it again showed the willingness to use force, and this is important from a diplomatic standpoint, because again, if you make a threat and you don't follow through, you lose all credibility. Now, the Middle East raged with conflict during this time, Lebanon in particular, as it had been a peaceful enclave until it fell into anarchy as different groups warred constantly. These groups included the Sunnis, the Shiites, the PLO, Syrian invaders. Israel forces pushed the PLO out in 1982, Palestinian Liberation Organization, and French, Italian, and U.S. forces moved into Lebanon as peacekeepers, but this only intensified Muslim distaste for American involvement. On October 23, 1983, an Islamic suicide bomber drove a truck with explosives into the U.S. Marine headquarters at Beirut. This killed 241 Americans, and the Marines would redeploy offshore. Now, the 1984 election is another landslide. Reagan goes up against Walter Mondale. Now, Mondale is he was the vice president under Jimmy Carter, and he was kind of the best option the Democrats had at the time. One notable thing about Mondale's candidacy is that Geraldine Ferraro was chosen as the vice presidential candidate. So she is the first woman in a major party to be put on the ticket, and so this is significant. So the second term, we get to Reagan and his practice on taxes. Now, this is where things get kind of fun. Reagan dared Democrats in Congress to raise taxes. He said that his veto pen was ready and, quote, "Go ahead, make my day." He quoted the great Clint Eastwood in this. That was Eastwood's quote in the Dirty Harry movies. So, again, the Democrats take over Congress, both houses, in 1986. And we do see in 1986 the Tax Reform Act. This reduced the number of federal tax brackets from 14 to 2 and reduced rates from maximum of 50% to 15 and 28%. Now, consider 14 tax brackets. You go to do your taxes. That is insane. Now it's down to 2. So again, he simplifies the tax code in this way. Now, one of the major issues, foreign policy, of course, is considered a strength for Reagan in many ways, but one of his major problems as president came in the foreign policy circles. This is the Iran-Contra affair. Now, in November of 1986, the press reports that American military supplies had been sold to Iran in exchange for the release of American hostages in Lebanon. These funds then were diverted to support Nicaraguan Contras. National Security Council aide Oliver North orchestrated these transfer payments from the basement of the White House. Congress had forbidden such aid, but high-level administration officials continued to do this nonetheless and would do their best to cover up the mess, shredding documents, etc. Now, when we talked about Nixon and Watergate, we talked about how often the crime itself can be forgiven as long as you come clean, admit responsibility, and move forward. This is not the case here, and again, it is Reagan's underlings who are mainly to blame for this. There is no link that was ever found between Reagan and the scandal itself. This is one reason that he is considered the Teflon president, because he had escaped scandal once again, and again, nothing stuck to him. He professed to not remember being told of these machinations, and knowing his leadership style, he was most likely being honest. Again, he relied on those below him to take care, to do the right thing for him. And so this, again, is another example of that occurring. Now, the Tower Commission would study this, and they would blame Reagan and his loose management style for the fiasco. But again, consider, one of the key theories of leadership is, and this is Collins comes up with this, he's a leadership expert, hire good people and leave them alone. Now, Reagan hired good people, he hired people he trusted, and he left them alone to do their job. He provided a great deal of independence to his staffers. One of the downsides of this type of leadership is that individuals do make bad decisions. Also, Reagan's core philosophy was that of decentralized authority. Again, he did not want to tell everyone what to do, just like he didn't want the federal government to dictate to the states. This is a core tenet of conservative ideology. So if the Tower Commission criticized him for this practice, credit should also be given to him for all the times his style worked, and it worked plenty. But again, this issue arose, it was a stain, and there was a lot of attention given to it, and rightly so. It was against the law. It was against the rules that had been set up. But again, this is what happens. Reagan trusted those under him, and this is one of the negative ramifications of that type of action. Now, we also have, as I mentioned before, and this is one of the things that Reagan is most noted for, is the end of the Cold War. Reagan was a Cold Warrior like few others, but he also saw the advantages of peace. He never threatened nuclear war, but he was a strong leader that other nations knew not to trifle with. When Mikhail Gorbachev ascended to the Soviet leadership in 1985, he promised a new policy of openness, and Reagan knew this was the time to act. He met with Gorbachev, and the two established a solid relationship which would lead to great progress down the road. Now, two key words associated with Gorbachev: glasnost and perestroika. Glasnost means openness, perestroika means reform. And after 7 centuries of Bolshevik Soviet rule, Gorbachev came in, westernized things, modernized things, opened things up, made huge changes. There was a new openness to Western ideas and goods, and reform to allow some market incentive to Soviet citizens. He wanted not only to improve relations between the two nations, but improve his own domestic reality in the Soviet Union, and realized he could not do this in a vacuum. In 1987, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty eliminated an entire class of existing nuclear weapons for the first time, those with immediate range of 300 to 3,000 miles. Now, this is significant. Again, this eliminates an entire class of nuclear weapons. June 12th of that year, Reagan visits the Berlin Wall. And this, again, one of the most famous episodes in his presidential history, and one of his more famous quotes. There is one sign the Soviets can make that would be unmistakable, that would advance dramatically the cause of freedom and peace. General Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Now, later in the speech, he recognized someone had spray painted "This wall will fall" on the wall, and he confirmed this wall will fall, for it cannot withstand faith. It cannot withstand truth. It cannot withstand freedom. Again, this is one of his more famous quotes. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Again, showing force. He is not backing down. He's willing to be strong, but he is using diplomatic measures as well. Now, some in his administration did not want him to word the speech in this way. They feared the verbiage may be embarrassing to Gorbachev or cause conflict. One of those who was afraid of Reagan speaking out was a guy named Colin Powell. But we'll move on from Colin. West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl disagreed. He stated this. He stated with regard to Reagan, he was a stroke of luck for the world, especially for Europe. So many around the world recognized the importance of Reagan, recognized his ideas and his actions, even if many liberal commentators at home did not. And one of the problems that we see with study of history in regarding Reagan is it is still quite politicized. Those on the left are unwilling to give him any credit. Those on the right are not willing to give him any criticism. And so this really polarizes academia with regard to Reagan, which is somewhat troublesome. But again, you can be the final arbiter of that, I guess. 1988, Soviet Union withdraws troops from Afghanistan. This was quite significant. 1989, this is the year that things really began to change. Poland elects a non-communist opposition government to their legislature, but Gorbachev refuses to send in tanks or troops to mandate acquiescence to Soviet authority. Ergo, the end of the Brezhnev Doctrine that we had read about previously. Communist regimes were ousted in Hungary and Czechoslovakia. Remember, Czechoslovakia had the Prague Spring in 1968. This would be called the Velvet Revolution, led by Václav Havel, who was a playwright and a great leader in his own right. Romanian dictator Nicolae Ceausescu and his wife were executed on live television. You could probably find a YouTube of it. It is quite disturbing, and it made the rounds in the media quite often back in '89. Yugoslavia, too, would dissolve its communist centralized authority, although this would lead to a bloody civil war that lasted for many years. Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania declared independence. The Berlin Wall, likely the most symbolic structure of the Cold War division in the world, as it divided East and West Berlin, communist and non-communist, and had been an issue for decades, was finally torn down. Images of youths using pickaxes to destroy the wall became commonplace and helped to exemplify the extraordinary thought in the war and the albeit limited modernization of the Soviet Union. In 1991, Gorbachev would give more autonomy to Soviet republics like the Ukraine and Belarus, while still keeping them under central control, but toward the end of the year, these republics would declare independence for themselves. Melvin Leffler is considered one of the top scholars on the Cold War. His book, For the Soul of Mankind, argued that the end of the Cold War should be attributed to the ideas and efforts of Reagan and Gorbachev together, specifically their leadership style, vision, and ability to work things out. And indeed, these two did lead to the end of the Cold War. Now, we also have what's called the Reagan Doctrine. This would pledge American support to freedom fighters opposing communism anywhere in the world. For example, we talked about El Salvador, Grenada, the Mujahideen rebels in Afghanistan who fought the Soviets. This would come back to bite us as well. We also see during this time state-sponsored terrorism. Governments such as Syria, Libya, and Iran were training terrorist groups on their own soil. Reagan warned these nations that if the U.S. Could ever prove a link between an act of terror and a foreign government, there would be consequences. Reagan stayed true to his word after there was a link found between the bombing of a West Berlin discotheque and Libya. U.S. planes bombed Libya in April of 1986, including the home of leader Muammar al-Gaddafi. Now, again, we've talked about some of the strengths, and we'll talk about his assessment here. Some of the weaknesses we see with him. The Iran-Contra affair. Again, he trusted those beneath him. Probably should have had tighter control on this. Another major weakness that many point out with regard to Reagan, in the early 80s, a newly identified malady called AIDS began to impact the health of many Americans. Public health officials reported it particularly affected gay men and intravenous drug users. And not a lot of attention was given to trying to find out what the solution was to this. The Reagan administration showed little interest, and Reagan's advisors convinced him not to engage the issue because it was seen as, quote, a gay issue. So this is quite a negative. This does hang over his head. This is a shadow that hangs over the Reagan legacy for many people. It is unfortunate, but it is something that needs to be recognized. Now, the assessment of Reagan. Let's look at him in his totality. The type of leader the nation needed at the time. We were dispirited, disillusioned, disappointed at the track the nation had taken. Remember, in 80, we had just in the last 10 years we had seen the end of Vietnam, an unpopular war. We had seen Watergate, which led to the first resignation of a president in our history. We had seen stagflation ruin the economy. We had seen a declining international status, as exemplified by the Iranian hostage takeover. After 4 years of Carter's pessimism and blame, Reagan's optimism was refreshing. It altered the psyche of Americans at an important time. His economic policies did work for the average American. Economists dubbed this era, quote, the Great Expansion, a 20-year era of prosperity and productivity, but budget deficits were his biggest negative, although a democratically run Congress did have something to do with this. He did not eliminate welfare programs, as fearmongers claimed he would, but he did fine-tune them. Social Security and Medicare, for example, the two things Republicans supposedly wanted to do away with the most, were not even touched. Federal agencies he wanted to abolish, such as the Department of Education, also survived, and often saw their budgets only grow, again mainly due to a Democratic Congress. Reagan himself claimed that a federal agency was, quote, is the nearest thing to eternal life we'll see on this earth. Now that's pretty funny. And he's pretty accurate about that as well. One of the keys here is that Reagan did not want to eliminate Social Security or Medicare. He saw those as very important for those in the country who needed the assistance. Again, he helped to end the Cold War. Some would argue he was the major player. Others, mostly critics, would argue he was just in the right place at the right time, but without a doubt, he played a part in the peace process and in the end of bad relations with the Soviet Union. Remember, he wanted to escalate spending so that the Soviets would emulate it and the Soviets would go bankrupt, and that's exactly what happened. If we contrast him to Carter, Carter was quite weak internationally. Again, the Davis Accords with Egypt and Israel were significant, but otherwise he was seen as a pushover. He was not as strong as Reagan was. When Reagan comes to power, he shows his strength, and this makes a difference. But again, arguably most important about Reagan, he renewed America's self-confidence and its sense of possibility. The American mindset was a dour one when he took office, but when he left, it was very much on the uptick. Now, I have mentioned some of the political difficulties with regard to Reagan and how he is looked at. Again, this is all we need to take into account, the positives and the negatives. He was not maybe he was the greatest president. Some would argue that. He was not the greatest human being to ever walk the earth. He was not perfect. But at the same time, he deserves a lot more credit than many scholars are willing to give him. One other key event we see at this time, he would appoint Sandra Day O'Connor as the first female Supreme Court justice. Now, one criticism of Reagan was his appointment of, quote, far right-wing Supreme Court justices. O'Connor was no right-winger. This only, again, further proves the lack of objectivity when we discuss Reagan, because his placement of O'Connor as a Supreme Court justice was huge. Just like when Thurgood Marshall was nominated and made the first African-American Supreme Court justice, having the first female Supreme Court justice was quite a change. So that is the Reagan Revolution. You can wonder, was it a true revolution? Was it just a change, a slight change? Was it just an evolution? But Reagan did change things quite a bit. Consider, again, the previous presidents. Lyndon Johnson, not a very popular guy. Richard Nixon, not a very popular guy. Jimmy Carter, not a very popular guy. Ronald Reagan, quite popular, quite strong, quite positive. He would change things quite a bit. So we'll leave it at that. That's Reagan Part 2. I don't think I have anything to add on that. I do have a few social and cultural issues that I wouldn't mind talking about, but we'll see where we get with those.